Hi everyone, so today I'm going to be showing you how I made this animation and the process it took to get from Marvelous Designer to Blender. As you can see, there's a slight animation in the texture moving left to right. I'll be taking you through that as well as the basics of how to create a garment like this. All of the files will be available on my Gumroad if you want to download it there for $1. Otherwise, you're welcome to follow along, as this is a completely free tutorial. You'll just have to use your own textures when importing them into Blender or Marvelous. So the first thing we're going to be doing is importing the lembic animation which I included in the Gumroad file. It's a basic walk cycle. Once that's important, you'll see an avatar pop up in the viewfinder. This will be the base model for our design. Once we have that set up, we can now go back to our reference and see what we're going to be designing. We're going to start with the polygon tool to create a basic shape around our avatar. I normally like to start with a square structure just so I can place my objects in the right 3D space before customizing it as I like. So as you can see, we've left some spaces for the arms, the waist and the neck. From there, we're going to create a symmetric pattern, which is basically going to be the backside of our garment. We're then going to reposition in the 3D space before stitching it together. It's always best to set your fabric from the start just so you know what you're working with and how the physics are going to work. So we're going to set up a nylon featherweight material. This is going to be the main hoodie material. We're going to set a color just so we can see it better in the viewport. I normally like to place the backside of my garment above my avatar in the 2D viewport area. It's always best to set your particle distance to 10 or less. It just helps for more detailed animation. Now that we've got the fabric set up, we can begin customizing the garment. I'm going to use the smooth curve tool to create the neck and arm holes. As you can see, when we do it, it changes the symmetrical pattern, which is the backside, at the same time. By pressing Z, we can now customize the points and adjust them as we like. You guys are welcome to follow along with mine, or you can just create your own. Now that we have the base front and back set up, we're now going to start the segment sewing. We're going to sew the shoulders and the sides. Make sure you don't cross over or else you're going to end up like something like this, which will then affect your simulations. So make sure the points of your sewing is always at the correct spot. If there's no avatar interferences, then you can click simulate and you should have something like this. I'm going for an oversized look, so I'm just going to adjust it to add some more material and make it look a bit more oversized. As per the reference, the shoulders of the garment were going over the avatar's shoulders, so I've adjusted it accordingly. Now we're going to be working on the arms. You can start with a basic square, use the smooth curve tool to create an edge. This is going to be where the arm connects to the front and back of the hoodie. We're then going to add a point. You can either press X or go to your menu bar to select it. This will allow us to sew the garment to the back and front correctly. To make it a little bit more oversized, I'm just adding more material to this face and I'm shortening the sleeve a bit. Once I'm happy with that, I can now start positioning in the 3D space before doing the sewing. Make sure that the sewing is in the correct space for the front and back of the garment. We're going to start with the top of the sleeve before connecting it at the bottom. This will allow our simulation to simulate and wrap around the arm before sewing it up completely. It's a little bit long for me, so I'm just going to cut the sleeve up a bit. From there, I'm going to create a symmetrical sleeve for the other arm and then repeat the sewing technique. Once I'm happy with that, I'm going to save it and run a base simulation just to see how things are working. The fabric is a bit light and buoyant, so I'm going to change my physical properties to denim raw to create a more heavier fabric. I'm then going to proceed to customize the sleeves a bit more before adding some edges to the sleeves. For this process, I'm going to press Z, click the edge of the sleeve, and then create an offset as internal line. I'm going to set this to about 50 millimeters as the cuff looks quite big. From there, I'm going to do a cut and sew. This will essentially create a new piece of the garment and keep the sewing aligned. From there, I'm now going to shrink it a little bit just so the fabric is tighter on the arms, bottom of the arms. And then I'm going to run the animation again. Once I'm happy with that, I'm now going to do similar technique to the bottom of the hoodie. We'll do the offset as internal line at 50 millimeters, cut and sew, and then shrink it a little bit to make a tighter waist. And then simulate it. As you can see on the hoodie, there's a flap on the sleeves. So let's recreate that. We're going to press Z on the keyboard and then select the outline that we want. From there, we're going to go offset as internal line and set it to around 100 millimeters. We then can do cut and sew, followed by copy, paste of that section. This will allow us to recreate that overlap. We'll then reposition in the 3D space before resetting 3D arrangement. Positioning it correctly and then removing this sewing that was originally there by saying delete sewing. From there, we're going to create a symmetric pattern, which will be our right arm. We're then going to use the smooth curve tool to create that overlap and adjust accordingly until we're happy. We're then going to sew it to the bottom piece that we cut and sewed from. And run the animation to see what it looks like. Give it some time and then you should get your result. From there, we're going to remove the linked editing feature, which will separate the back from the front of our garment. You'll now be able to adjust the front without affecting the back. To adjust the neckline, we're going to use the smooth curve tool. This will allow us to create more of a curve on the front neck. Once we're happy with that, we're going to use the add point and select a piece in the middle. This will be helpful for later when we set up the hoodie. Once we're happy with that, we're going to now work on the neck piece, which is going to be inside of our hood piece. Once set up in the 3D space, we'll then create a symmetrical piece before sewing it. You'll then add a point to both sides before sewing it. You'll see why now. For the sewing, we'll select the one side to the front of our garment and then the other side to the back of our garment. Make sure to add a point on the back side of the garment as well, so this technique works. As you can see in the 3D viewport, the sewing has been aligned. Once you're happy with that, we'll adjust in the 3D viewport space and then run an animation. I like it to be a little bit longer, so I've adjusted its height. Once I'm happy with that, I'm going to use the offset as internal line technique before cut and sew, followed by layer clone over. This basically creates a copy of that pattern and sews it straight onto that to make a thicker edge. This technique we'll be using throughout this video. So far, I'm really happy with how things are looking. We are now going to work on the hood section. We'll create a basic shape, set it up in the 3D viewport. And create a symmetric pattern before adding points to the bottom, which will connect to our neck piece, and then sewing it on. For this section, we're going to be using the free sewing technique. This will allow us to get around the curves of the hood. Once those are aligned, we're now going to connect it to the neck piece. If all our sewing is correct, we can run the simulation and we should get something like this. If the ear comes through, you can always just adjust it in the 3D viewport. To help with that, you can also select all the material and make sure that particle distance is under 10 millimeters. You can also adjust the collision to 5. And then in the 3D viewport, just adjust it. You should get a good result from that. I really like how things are looking, so now I'm going to add a seam to the front of the hood. We'll create the seam and put it in the 3D viewport position, and then create a symmetric pattern from it. We'll then sew it onto our hood, connect the seams to one another, and simulate it from there. We'll then do a layer clone over on both sides, just to create that extra thickness. So far it's looking great. If there's a little bit of mess up in the simulation, you can always reset to 2D arrangement or 3D arrangement and run the simulation again. For this section, the issue I was facing was that the cloned over pattern wasn't directly in front of the seam, so its stitching in the 3D viewport was incorrect. But just by correcting it and putting it in front of the seam, it helped us in the simulation to make it look a lot better. Now looking back at our reference, we're going to work on front of the hoodie. For this, we're going to go to our internal polygon. We're going to set up the left side of the garment, copy, and then mirror paste to set up the right side. And then do the front. Once those lines are set up, we can cut and sew each section. This will allow us to copy the pattern and create that flap in the front. Before we begin the segment sewing, we can adjust the pattern in the 3D viewport. I'm now going to sew the front pattern to the garment. As you can see, when we run the simulation, there's a slight flap, but I kind of want to create a little bit more. So I'm going to use the smooth curve tool to create that. Now you can see there's a lot more fabric hanging in the front. To add some texture, we're going to press Z, we're going to right click and offset as internal line. Then going to set this to 10 millimeters before cut and sewing, and then layer clone over. We're going to do this on both sides just to create some more detail in the garment. I'm really liking what it's looking like. From here, we're going to create some detail on the sleeves by following the same technique. Outline inside, cut and sew, offset as internal line at 10 millimeters, cut and sew, and layer clone over. I'm going to repeat this on the right side as well. Now we're going to work on the hood pockets. We're going to use the internal polygon tool to create this on the front of our hood. We're then going to use the smooth curve tool to adjust the pockets. Once we're happy with that, we can then cut and sew. Followed by copy, paste of that pattern, repositioning in the 3D viewport, and then sewing it on. When you run your simulation, it should look something like this. To create a bigger pocket, I'm going to adjust the points at the bottom of this pattern to create more material, and then run the simulation again. I'm really happy with how that's looking. For detail, we're going to create those seams like we've done with the sleeves, as well as the flap on the front of the hood. We're now going to add some holes into the seams on the hood. For this, you can use the internal ellipse tool. We'll then go to the seams on the hood, and draw up the circles at the bottom. It will automatically place them on the other seams. You can then right click and convert to hole. You'll then see that there's now holes in the seam of the hood. Once you're happy with that, we can do some basic material placements. We do this in Marvelous just so that when we take it into Blender, it'll be easier to find those materials that we need to work with. For this, you can go into your UV editor, right click and say reset UV to 2D arrangement. Followed by right click, fit all UV to 0 to 1 and then click OK. This will just better arrange your UV maps when taking it into Blender. Once you're happy with that, and go back to your 2D pattern window. From here, we're now going to select your fabric and change the texture to the one that is included in the folder. This is our watercolor. As you can see, it's looking really cool. Let's select all the patterns just to make sure that our particle distance is the same or less than 10. And for all the seams, we're going to adjust to 5, just so that we can get some better simulation. The reason our hoodie looks so dark is because our color isn't set to white. Once we change it back to white, we get the real look of our texture. From here, we're going to copy and paste our fabric and create a new one. This is going to be our white fabric. We can click on our texture and change it to Hoodie Textiles, which is included in the folder in Gumroad. From here, we can adjust our pattern to how we want. We can do this by selecting the pattern we want, clicking apply in the fabrics window. This is what I ended up with at the end. I'm very happy with it. From here, we're going to run the base simulation, which was loaded in the beginning. Once this is complete, you can go File, Export, and do MDD Cache Standard. Set your export location and save. Make sure your image size is above 3000 just to get higher quality textures. Once it is done, you can load it into Blender by selecting File, Import, OBJ. You guys will already have this file set up if you have downloaded the Gumroad file. Otherwise, you can just follow the steps from here. In this video, I don't show you lighting setup, so it's entirely up to you how you place your lights. But if you do have the Blender file in my Gumroad, then you will have everything set up for you and you'll get an exact look and feel for what I'm going for. Normally when you import, you have to do a little bit of rotation. From here, we're going to add a mesh cache modifier, which is your MDD file which you exported from Marvelous Design. This is going to be your basic simulation. Once that's done, you can adjust the axis mapping to -Z. This will flip it back to where it was. Let's just run a simulation to make sure everything is good. Now we can begin adjusting our materials. So for that, we're going to go to our shade editor view. We're going to add image texture and then select fabric 019 color, which is also in the folder supplied. We're then going to attach it to basic color and the alpha of the principal BSDF, followed by adding a value, texture coordinates, and mapping. You can set it up accordingly. The UV goes into the vector, value goes into scale, and the vector goes into the vector. From there we can adjust the scale to how we like it. We can then add another image texture for the roughness. When zooming in, you can see that the scale is adjusted by changing the value. We are now going to change the watercolor material. For this, you can simply go to edit mode and select the surface of the watercolor, just to make sure that we are clicking on the right material. Because as you can see in the materials panel, there's 3 different materials. Once you do that, it should click on the right one. We can then rename it to watercolor. For this, we're going to do the same what we did to the other material. We're going to add mapping, texture coordinate, and value. When you connect it, it's going to be a bit funky, but don't worry. There's some changes that need to be made. You can go into the image texture and select watercolor. This will totally replace what was originally there and will look funny at first. But once you delete the other properties and adjust the value of the scale, we should be all good. As you can see, it's already creating somewhat of movement in the render viewport. You can adjust it to however you like. I ended up going with something like this. We are then going to set up keyframes for the watercolor to animate it. We're going to start at 60 because that's going to be our first frame we're going to be rendering. So for this, you can simply hover over your location area and click I to set a keyframe. We're going to start on 0. We can then go to the end of the sequence, which is frame 500, and set it up to 5, 2, and 3. You can do whatever numbers you want, but these are just what I chose. From there you can see that the water is now moving left to right in our animation. Now that we've set that up, we can start to texturize the material bits. I wanted a glossy waterproof type material. It's really up to what you like most or how your eye sees best. So adjust those settings to however you want. Once you're happy with that, we can now set up the render. I just set my max sampling to 128 and I always use motion blur as it looks most realistic. For our scene, we're going to render from frame 60 to 500. We are then going to set our render location and accept. Now let's render. Once you're done rendering, you should get something that looks a little bit like this. This is the first time I've done something like this, so I'm really stoked with how it came out. If you guys want to show some support, make sure to drop a sub and a like. I'd really appreciate that. Also have a Discord, so if you guys have any questions, you're welcome to pop in there. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video. Cheers.